Greetings to all of the friends and clients of Husch Blackwell, and welcome to our Health Law and Innovation virtual series. We are pleased to be able to bring to you the first in a 7-part series on current health law issues. Today, we are going to be talking about the COVID-19 vaccine. The COVID-19 vaccine is in our daily news. It is prevalent around all of us and everything we see. I heard just recently that The Hill is reporting that there is concern by former FDA officials that all of the talk is beginning to potentially undermine public trust and confidence in the vaccines, which is one of the things we'll talk about in our session today. But it's very prevalent. Our goal today is to talk about vaccine issues from a clinical and from a legal perspective. While there are lots of unanswered questions, as I suspect you all are aware of, again, our hope is that we can demystify a little bit from the clinical perspective and from the legal perspective about where things currently stand, and maybe a little bit of thought and insight about where we, from a clinical perspective or from a legal perspective, see things going with regard to the COVID-19 vaccine. So a bit today about our panel for the discussion. My name is Tom Shorter. I am a partner in the Husch Blackwell Health, Life Sciences, and Education Strategic Business Unit. And I am currently based in our Madison, Wisconsin office. And today I'm going to be able to have the great fortune to serve as a moderator for a wonderful panel. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce to each of you that are in attendance the panel members. So our guest panelists today, we are extremely pleased and fortunate to be able to be joined today by Dr. Edward Belongia. Dr. Belongia is the director for the Center of Clinical Epidemiology and Population Health at Marshfield Clinic Research Institute here in Marshfield, Wisconsin. He has done an amazing amount of research in the area of vaccine efficacy and safety, and will bring a wealth of knowledge in our discussion today about the clinical side of the COVID-19 vaccine and the process and what we may be anticipating, even though, again, there are lots of unanswered questions. Dr. Belongia was, in April of 2020, received a special appointment to the COVID-19 work group of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. So again, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Belongia, and we're looking forward to lots of good discussion about the clinical side of the COVID-19 vaccine issues.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you. I'm also very, very pleased to be able to be joined on this panel discussion by two of my colleagues here at Husch Blackwell. Julianne Story is a partner in our Kansas City office, a very experienced labor and employment practitioner, a member of our firm's executive committee. And Julianne has a wealth of knowledge, having worked with employers over many years as we dealt with issues associated with flu vaccine and how employers dealt with flu vaccine issues. And as you'll hear through our discussion today, there's lots of interesting analogies, but it's not a perfect fit. And we'll be talking more about that. So thank you, Julianne, for joining as well. I'm also joined by Seth Mailhot. Seth is in our Washington, D.C. office and leads the FDA practice group for our law firm. Seth brings a wealth of knowledge and some experience previously with the FDA. And Seth will be able to talk and give us some insights on, traditional legal process that is involved in vaccine approval and some of the issues that may arise in the context of the approval process for the COVID-19 vaccine as well. So wonderful resources. Thanks to all three of you for joining as panelists for our discussion today. So here's what we're going to try to cover in the next hour or so. These are some of the topics: timeline, approval process, distribution, safety issues, and of course, prevalent on everybody's mind, how our employer is going to be dealing with COVID-19 vaccine issues. So we'll be hitting on each of these topics through the course of the day, of the discussion. Let's start with a little bit of data and information. First, just general information out there. This is information as of September 27. This just shows where we currently stand in the United States on new cases and on new deaths. I think this is, again, part of what I'm sure most, if not all of you, are seeing on almost a daily basis. And we can see that the numbers continue to be very concerning, and it makes the vaccine issue, as I mentioned at the start, very, very prevalent in everybody's mind. So we'd also like to start today by gathering a little bit of data and information and feedback from all of you as attendees. And so we've designed a series of just 3 quick poll questions for you to be able to answer, and we'll display those results shortly after. We'll give everybody 10 or 15 seconds to be able to reply, and we'll show those results right away. So as a first starting point question for everybody, does your organization currently require at least some employees to get a yearly flu vaccine? So again, does your organization currently require at least some employees to get a yearly flu vaccine? We'll give you a moment to answer that. Okay. So we've got some of the initial responses, as a few more are coming in. It's interesting, again, to see getting closer to that about half that do in fact require yearly flu vaccines. Next poll question: is your organization planning to require at least some employees to get a COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available? So again, this is really about the planning ahead, thinking about whether or not you might, as employers, be asking your employees, or as employees being asked to get a COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available. Give me a moment. Okay, interesting information. Very, very interesting. Very much in the formative stages. I think this is one of the topics we're going to be talking a little bit today, and tapping a little bit into Julianne's experience on how to navigate through some of these from an employment perspective. So very helpful. And our last one: do you plan to personally get a COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available? So again, this is a question about you yourself as an attendee, what your thoughts are currently based on what you know. And we realize there's lots of unknowns still on this area, but do you plan to become getting a COVID-19 vaccine? Give you a moment. Okay. So it looks like a good many of our attendees today, a little over half or so, are definitely leaning in that direction. And I would suspect that's a good reflection of, quite frankly, where a good many folks are currently across the country. So thank you for participating in those survey questions. That's very helpful. It's helpful as well for our panelists as they provide commentary today, to kind of have a level set of information about where you currently stand. Okay, so let's dive into some of our panel discussion now. And you'll see we have a few topics there. I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists. And we're going to start out with what I have to believe is, quite frankly, the question that every one of us, as we see the news on a daily basis, crosses our mind. And Dr. Belongia, I would love to start with you on this one. And it really is, what's the timeline? When can we expect, based on what we currently know, that we will actually see a vaccine available in the United States?
Well, that's the $50,000 question. The shorter answer is right now, nobody knows for sure because it really depends on what happens in the phase 3 trials. And I can explain a little bit about sort of how those trials work to help people understand. But in general, I would say just based on the fact that we have at least 3 large phase 3 trials in progress right now with leading candidate vaccines supported by the US government. Overall, there are 11 different vaccines that are in phase 3, which is late stage development. There's certainly a possibility that by the end of this year or early in 21, we will have a vaccine that has met the criteria for being both efficacious as well as being safe. And at that point, then the FDA could choose to issue an emergency use authorization and make the vaccine available. But it's also possible that the results won't come in that fast, that it will take longer. More cases will have to accrue before a determination can be made that the vaccine is working. And the FDA has set a bar of 50%. That is, any vaccine must achieve 50% protection in order to be considered for emergency approval. And so in order to show that they have that level of protection, they will need to have a certain number of cases. And depending on how much COVID activity there is and how many cases occur in study participants, that might occur by the end of this year, or it might not occur until the first quarter of next year.
Interesting. And you referenced in your comments that there are currently 3 that are in that final phase or getting close there too. How many vaccines are out there being developed as we currently speak right now?
Last I checked, there are over 180 that are in development. The vast majority of those are in what we would call preclinical development. That is, they're not being tested yet in people. We have 43 that are currently being tested in human clinical trials. And the New York Times has an excellent COVID vaccine tracker that they update daily. If you want to sort of monitor that, if you're interested, that's a good source of up-to-date information. And then there are 11 in phase 3, which is the last phase of development. And there are, well, we can get into this a little bit later, but there are some interesting different technologies. There's some, a UK company, US company, developing a couple of US companies developing very innovative vaccines that are in late stage trials.
Right. And in this, as we look and focus on those that are in the later stage trials, and those numbers start to get smaller, of course, that are those that are in that phase, how does this connect to actual production? I as a novice in understanding the clinical side of this, is the reality that they will wait until the full completion of the trial before production begins, and what's the timeline associated with that? So just some comments and thoughts from you, Dr. Belongia. When does production really start? Because I think that would go into the timeline as well.
Sure, that's a great question, and we'll talk a little bit about the traditional sort of timeline, I think, in a couple of minutes. But typically it can take a decade to go through all of the steps to bring a vaccine to licensure, and a large investment of hundreds of millions of dollars to do that, proceeding through various phases. So with COVID, of course, we don't have time to do that. We can't spend a decade developing a vaccine. So there are a number of shortcuts that are being taken to try and speed the process up while still maintaining high standards of both vaccine efficacy and safety. So one of those things is to combine phases. That is, you start with the early phases and then the later phases, and you can sort of combine those into a single study that will shorten the timeline. And another factor that is being done right now with the support of the US government is to basically begin production of these vaccines, of the promising vaccines, even before the clinical trials have shown that they work. Normally, a company would never do that, right? It makes no economic sense for a company to begin manufacturing a vaccine before they know if it works. But in this case, it can greatly shorten the time lag if, as soon as they have the scientific evidence that the vaccine is both effective and safe, they have millions of doses available to distribute instead of having to wait 6 or 12 months longer in order to manufacture those. So they're taking an economic risk, or essentially the government is taking an economic risk by providing support to manufacture these vaccines even while the trials are still underway.
So that's a very interesting point, and something I think is not probably well understood and recognized in the general public. So in essence, the federal government is contracting with a number of the vaccine production companies that are doing this, and it's possible that a lot of those dollars, if that is not the vaccine that ends up being successful, will really just be part of the overall cost of this, even though there won't be any actual vaccine from that particular manufacturer.
Yeah. That's right. I think that is the role of the federal government in this case, because no company is going to be willing to take that kind of financial risk, I think. So that's where it's appropriate for the government to step in and say it is in the interest of our population to take this risk. But I would note also that this isn't totally novel in the sense that there's a U.S. government agency called BARDA that has actually been supporting innovative vaccine development for a number of years. And they actually supported some of the technologies that are now being used to develop COVID vaccines, but were used a decade ago to develop flu vaccines. And so the government has been doing this to sort of support innovative things that otherwise industry isn't doing.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And a nice segue into the next of our topical discussions, which was your comments about what the standard vaccine development pathway looks like. And we got some thoughts from you on the sort of clinical side. And so I think it would be very helpful to, at this point, to pose a question, Seth, to you from a FDA practitioner standpoint, to talk a little bit about what is the normal process for vaccine approval from the FDA's standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you look at the process, you're talking about what's called a biologics license application, or BLA. Under the BLA, FDA considers the safety, the purity, and the potency of the vaccine. In all practical terms, what we're really focused in on is safety and the ability of the vaccine to elicit a protective immune response, or immunogenicity. When FDA goes through the biologics license application process, it's really thinking about two things. One, the product itself, and then two, the process by which the vaccine is manufactured. Because under the world of FDA, you have biologics and then you have traditional drugs. Traditional drugs are usually small compounds, very simply manufactured through a chemical process. Because a biologic has, it's almost like making chicken soup. You can never really know what's in it. So to some extent, because we can't fully characterize a biologic in the way that we could fully characterize a drug, there's a lot of focus on the manufacturing process as well. So the biologics license application is looking at both things, both the manufacturing process, which gets the license, and the product itself, the vaccine that's produced. As Dr. Bologna said, there's a series of tests, clinical trials that are run under different phases. Those are done under what's called an investigational new drug application, or an IND. Even though it's a drug application or drug exemption, it still applies to biologics products. So once the clinical data is collected and the BLA is submitted through to FDA, FDA will traditionally consult with its Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. That's an outside group of experts that provides a non-binding advisory decision on the safety and efficacy of the vaccine for the proposed indication. Now, FDA doesn't have to follow the recommendations of this committee in its review, but traditionally it would consider strongly what the recommendations of this committee are.
So, I heard Dr. Belongia reference that, period in a traditional timeline could be upwards of a 10-year period. And that would be a traditional, sounds like a traditional process. Here, of course, we're in a very different mode and it's moving at a different speed. And I've heard both of you reference in prior conversations that we've had this difference between licensure and emergency use authorization. Could you break that down a little bit, Seth, for the non-FDA practitioners like myself that are listening in?
Yeah, absolutely. So an emergency use authorization is a special authority that has been granted the FDA when there is an emergency. And the emergency use authorization grants FDA the authority to allow the use of an unapproved medical product in an emergency that addresses a chemical, biological, or radiological or nuclear threat when there's no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. This is authorized under the PrEP Act. And so FDA's process, generally it's an expedited process where we can leave off some of the testing that FDA would normally want to see, as well as some of the formal submissions that would normally be submitted to FDA. But because this is, to a large extent, it's almost an ad hoc process. So FDA's decision making on what is the right amount of data can evolve. For example, we've been seeing changes just in masks. There's an emergency use authorization that FDA continually updated as to what types of masks FDA would authorize under an EUA. And the same goes with vaccines. In fact, we've seen too where FDA, in response to some of the concerns over prior EUAs that have been issued for other treatments for COVID-19, FDA had announced that it was going to tighten or issue guidance that would strengthen the requirements that vaccines would have to go through if they wanted to follow the emergency use authorization process. We actually haven't seen that guidance yet. We believe it's been held up by the administration, but that gives you some sense as to what this emergency use authorization looks like and how it plays out.
That's great. Thanks, Seth. And Dr. Belongia, thinking about that licensure versus emergency use authorization issue, I'm curious on your thoughts on what's the clinical side of that, the practical side of that being utilized for purposes of development of vaccines?
Well, certainly there will be less follow-up, and there, basically as soon as the threshold is met, let's say, well, let me back up and just explain a bit about sort of how these phase 3 trials work and what might trigger an emergency use authorization. these studies in general have around 30,000 or more participants, because that's how many it takes in order to detect a vaccine effectiveness of 50% or higher, based on their estimates of how many people will develop COVID. And so typically now people in a trial are followed for a long period of time. And in this case, they'll be followed for a year or two. But obviously the companies and the government don't want to wait a year or two to get the results from the trial as they would normally do with a normal vaccine. So in this case, they have what they call interim looks. That is, after a certain number of COVID cases have occurred in people who are in the study, an independent monitoring board separate from the company will get to take a peek at the data, basically, and see, does it look like the vaccine is working? Has it met our threshold of 50%? And we can say that statistically, we have met the bar. And so depending on the company and the protocol, they have different looks. Some of the companies, like Moderna, have 2 interim looks planned after a certain number of people. I can't remember exactly, maybe 100 to 150 cases have occurred. They're going to take a look at the data and see if there's evidence that they have effectiveness at that point. And then they'll look again later on. Other companies like Pfizer, and Pfizer has been criticized a little bit about this, they're taking frequent looks. And they're going to look, as I understand it, even when they have less than 50 cases, which could potentially allow them to detect a vaccine that is very highly effective with even only 50 cases. But the downside of that is that it's very short-term follow-up, and it's based on a small number of people. So based on when those cases accrue, then the company, if they look and they see they have evidence that the vaccine is working at the level they want, they can then present that to the FDA, and the FDA can make a decision as to whether to issue the EUA. And of course, they also will be looking at the safety data.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. So let's transition to the next of our topics that we touched a little bit in some ways about, on this because of the discussion we had a moment ago about production and the idea that right now there is going to be a expedited production given the government's investment and support for that to be the case. That of course leads, I think, to a natural question, which is, okay, we've got it approved on an expedited basis. We've got production moving faster. How is distribution going to be handled? And really, Dr. Belongia, your thoughts on how will criteria be developed that will guide the distribution priorities?
Yeah, this is a very challenging issue. And there is no doubt that when the FDA does authorize a vaccine, there will be a limited supply of that vaccine. Even though they are likely producing it now, there may be millions of doses available. But even if there are 10 or 20 million doses available, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the demand. And so there will have to be prioritization early on until vaccine production ramps up in order to meet more effectively meet the demand. And frankly, any one company is probably not going to be able to meet this demand. We're looking at multiple vaccines being approved in order to meet the demand. And so the first vaccine is certainly not going to be the last. So there are a number of considerations on this. And some various groups around the country, including the National Academy of Medicine, Johns Hopkins, as well as international groups like the World Health Organization, have all tried to take a look at this. A CDC advisory committee, the ACIP, is also looking at this, and the slide that you've got up there is from an ACIP meeting. And there seems to be broad agreement across these different groups that healthcare personnel are the highest priority for receiving the vaccine initially. And that comprises around 20 million or so people who are just in healthcare. And the slide here, the red bar actually is not just healthcare, but that also includes other high-risk populations on the red bar there. So healthcare personnel are high risk, I think, for reasons everyone probably understands, and high priority for getting the vaccine. But then beyond healthcare personnel, then it gets very complicated because there are a number of other groups that you could argue really should be high priority. And these include people with a high-risk medical condition, and that's over 100 million people in the US, because people with high-risk medical conditions are more likely to be hospitalized or die with COVID. People over age 65, and that's over 50 million people in the US. They are also much more likely to be hospitalized or die with COVID. And then lastly, essential workers, people who cannot work from home, cannot telework. They have to be out there to do their job, working with the public, interacting with the public to keep society functioning. And of course, that does include people with high-risk conditions and people over 65 as well. And so there are perhaps 80 million people in the essential worker population as well. And so the challenge then, sort of after the immediate phase of healthcare personnel, is, we don't have enough vaccine available to vaccinate all of those people, and how are we going to figure this out? And ACIP is wrestling with this issue. And right now, the feeling is that we just need more data. There are some key unknowns that we need answers to before we can really provide more helpful input on this. For example, we need to know about the vaccine. How effective is it? Does it work better in older adults, or does it work not as well in older adults? What are how does the vaccine storage work and the handling? Because there's one vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, has to be stored at ultra-low temperatures that are not available at most clinics that would provide immunizations, which means you can only distribute this vaccine at certain locations around the country that can provide these ultra-low temperatures for storage. Again, we don't know that because we don't know if the Pfizer vaccine is going to be the one that's authorized. And then how many doses are initially available? So all of these things will start to come together as we get an emergency use authorization. But right now, after healthcare workers, it's very difficult to sort of say for sure what the priority groups will be.
Yeah, interesting. And so, Seth, from your perspective in the FDA practice that you have, what do you see as potential legal issues arising? I can imagine that this issue of trying to help determine distribution and priorities, there may be a host of legal issues, and I'm curious on your thoughts from your vantage point on that topic.
Yeah, so I mean, from our perspective, I mean, we've seen some of the preliminary plans that HHS has issued. They submitted a report subject to the Operation Warp Speed program that they've run that details the general strategy that they're going to take with vaccine distribution. They've determined that they're going to use a centralized distribution means through McKesson, who's under contract with HHS. And the idea will be that they're going to track the ordering and allocation of the vaccine through HHS's vaccine tracking system. That said, because this is a combination of public and private entities, there's always the possibility of hoarding and price gouging. And just from our perspective, what we've seen through mask allocations and other personal protective equipment, we've seen some limited charges under the Defense Production Act. So that clearly is a potential issue, especially if we're talking about very tight supplies early on and questions over which groups or which individuals are going to receive the vaccine and which groups aren't going to receive the vaccine. If there are individuals that try to game the system or take advantage of it in order to either make a unreasonable profit or are otherwise taking resources that should be allocated to other individuals, you could clearly see those types of cases come up.
Indeed, more to come on that as this all develops. But given limited supply, I can foresee those. Julianne, you work with a number of employers in different industries, including, of course, healthcare. And I'm imagining from a labor and employment lawyer's perspective, this idea of what industries are going to get priority. Thoughts from your perspective as well. If you could share your thoughts on this topic.
Yes, Tom. I think as the slide shows, and as Dr. Belongia mentioned, the healthcare personnel are probably going to be at the top of the priority list when the vaccine becomes available. But we have seen in the news how the workplaces in other industries have been impacted. For example, the meat processing facilities where people are working in close proximity to one another, and the high rate of instances of COVID infection and the complaints that were coming out of those facilities for OSHA and EEOC related complaints against the employer. So, I think that other industries ought to be paying attention to this vaccine issue. If they're not already, I think, food processing, food production, employers who are involved in supply chain, things that necessities of life, to keep things moving in our society, to prevent shortages for the things that people need on a daily basis. So food production, like I said, and other industry, manufacturing and distribution.
Indeed. And I'm sure part of it will be prioritization even among types of employers. I can imagine that concept coming up in the context of how an employer might, even a healthcare employer, might make decisions about priority among their own employees. So we're going to come back to some of the fascinating employment issues here in a moment with Julianne, but definitely some sticky issues that are there. Let's spend a little bit of time, if we could, and transition to another area where I think there's lots of consideration publicly and perhaps misunderstanding going on, given the level of politicization of the vaccine. Let's talk about safety. So, Dr. Belongia, given your expertise and the focus of the work you do on safety and efficacy, what are the kinds of protections that the general, population, myself and others on this webinar, need to understand about the protections to ensure the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines that are currently in development?
Yes, I think that's a very, very important question, especially because of the way the science has been politicized here in a way that prior vaccines have not been, and with a focus on we need to get a vaccine as soon as possible. But the real priority is we need to get a vaccine that works and is safe as soon as possible. And there are a number of mechanisms in place to ensure that. As we discussed when we were talking about the clinical trials, safety is an important outcome. And so each of these trials has 30,000 or more people, and half of which are getting the vaccine. And they're monitoring safety, both in terms of how people are feeling during the week or so after vaccination. They look for side effects like, do you have muscle aches and fatigue and fever and headache? And do you have painful sore arm where you got the injection? Those are kind of obvious things. But then people are followed for a longer period of time to see if they develop any unexpected side effects or problems as a result of the vaccine. And they look to see if those are occurring more frequently in the people who receive the vaccine compared to people who receive the placebo. Because keep in mind, and we'll get to this when we talk about the specific example of a trial that was halted, things happen by chance. And so the fact that someone is, say, hospitalized after they get the vaccine doesn't necessarily mean that the vaccine was the cause of that. And that's why they have a control group who received just basically a saline injection. So the FDA will look at the data from the clinical trials to look at safety. In addition, as Seth mentioned, there's this independent advisory committee that the FDA has, and they will take an independent look at the data. And they are not government employees. They are experts with no conflict of interest who are looking at the data independently and advising FDA. In addition to that, the CDC has a committee called ACIP, which is an independent advisory, and they will also look at the safety data as well as the efficacy data and make a recommendation. And again, they are vetted for conflict of interest, so they should be really representing the American public, and they are all experts in vaccines and related topics. So there are a number of steps to assure the safety. However, I just think it's important for people to keep in mind this is an emergency use authorization, which means FDA is assessing that the benefits outweigh the risks. We will not know as much about vaccine safety when this vaccine is approved as we would with a licensed vaccine that has gone through a much longer development process. And so it will be very important that there is what we call post-approval or monitoring. That is, once we start using the vaccine in the real world, we start giving it to healthcare personnel, we start giving it to older adults, there are a number of systems that will be in play to monitor for any safety issues in the real world in real time. And I'll very briefly just mention them just to sort of give you a flavor of those, and if we want to later we can talk more about them. One of them is called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. And that's where doctors and the public and the manufacturers all have to report into this government database on any bad outcomes or any problems that occurred after the vaccine. Another one that's been set up specially for COVID is called VSafe. It's called the Vaccine Safety Assessment in Essential Workers. And that is specifically set up to be able to monitor that first wave of vaccines that go out to healthcare personnel, where that's not a group we normally have a really good window into for vaccine safety. And so this is a special system that's going to use smartphones and web-based surveys to survey people, healthcare personnel who receive the vaccine, to find out if they're having any side effects or problems as a result of it. And then there are a number of others. Once the vaccine becomes more widely available to the general public, there's something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which uses electronic health records and electronic immunization records from millions of people around the country. And the Marshfield Clinic is part of that. Our own research team is part of that with funding by CDC. And we will be monitoring in almost real time for specific potential adverse events or complications after vaccination. We'll have a list of things, and we'll be looking to see if these are occurring more often than expected among people who are getting a COVID vaccine. There are several others, and so I think these are things the general public generally does not know, but it's very important to realize that we'll have the best safety data we have based on the phase 3 trials, and then even after the vaccine is being used, we're going to continue to monitor safety in real time. Over.
Yeah, thank you. And a very real part of that, because I would imagine these issues, and I know these issues will lead into public trust associated with this. As I mentioned at the start, there's certainly some questions about some of the information that's out there. And that public trust, I would imagine, Dr. Belongia, is an important component to sort of safety and efficacy, is having people feel comfortable and safe taking the vaccine.
Public trust is absolutely essential. And quite frankly, we've been going in the wrong direction with our public messaging. It has been a complete dumpster fire, to put it mildly, in terms of public messaging, because of basically the, statements that we have to have a vaccine quickly, or suggestions that maybe a vaccine would be approved even before it's been reviewed, but before these independent advisory groups. I think people really need to realize, and we need to convey, you know, the clear message that we're not cutting corners here. It is an emergency use authorization, but the safety standards are not being compromised in any way. And I think it's very, very important that we hear from all levels of government that these independent advisory groups are going to be asked for input, and their input is going to be respected. And so I think it would give people a lot of confidence to know that, you know, any vaccine that's going to be shipped will be reviewed and approved by this FDA advisory group and the CDC advisory group. And that should give people a lot of confidence that this has passed a sufficient level of review that it merits distribution.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's actually shift over a little bit, because I imagine many of the attendees at our webinar today are you know, in places of employment that are going to be starting to plan and think about the implications of all of this activity on what it means on their places of employment. And I also want to make sure I leave a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So let's switch over to this topic. And Julianne, this is your day in, day out practice. And so given your experience in having you know, worked through a lot of the issues associated with the flu vaccine and you know, the mandatory nature that some employers have taken relative to flu, give us your thoughts about this. On the COVID-19 side, do you see employers moving towards making this a mandate, and some of the legal issues that may come as a result of that?
Sure, Tom. So I think everybody is proceeding with caution. I think we can tell from the survey at the beginning that many are thinking about it, but employers have not yet implemented a mandate for the COVID vaccine. And that is probably wise, because whether an employer can mandate a COVID vaccine is the big question everyone's asking, but unfortunately there isn't a clear answer yet. There are three primary employment laws that are implicated by this question. The first is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or OSHA, which imposes a duty on employers to provide a workplace that is safe from recognized hazards. Secondly, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities and requires reasonable accommodation of people with disabilities unless doing so poses an undue hardship. And under the ADA, a reasonable accommodation is anything that allows the employee to do the job, modification of the job or the way it is performed, so that the employee can perform the essential functions. In the ADA context, undue hardship is undue burden or expense. And there's little definition, but I think what we know is it has to enable the person to do the job and without impacting the resources of the organization significantly. The third law is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination based on religion, which has a fairly low threshold. It's any sincerely held religious belief. And Title VII also requires accommodating individuals based on their religion, unless doing so poses an undue hardship. The terminology is the same under the ADA, but it is a lower threshold for employers to show undue hardship as to a religious accommodation. So in other words, it's easier for an employer to show undue hardship when someone is requesting a religious accommodation compared to a disability accommodation under the ADA. So what all of this means is that we ought to be able to follow the rules that have developed for seasonal flu vaccines now. In the healthcare context, we're used to seeing this, and the rule has been, and currently is, for the regular seasonal flu, the EEOC and the case law has developed for healthcare employers, at least, that you can mandate a flu vaccine, provided that you have exceptions for people with disabilities that can be accommodated or religious beliefs that can be accommodated. With COVID, I think as we just mentioned in the prior section, we are likely to see employees objecting based on fear for the reasons we discussed. And there may also be kind of conscientious objections based on anti-vaccination movement. Fear and the ethical obligations are not legally protected, but I wouldn't ignore them because of the significant practical implications for employers. There are morale implications of mandating vaccines in the face of an employee objection based on fear or conscience. Certainly the time and resources that it will take for an employer to go through the requests for reasonable accommodation, which the EEOC has said need to be handled on a case-by-case basis. And then the ultimate question for employers is, what are you going to do if someone refuses the vaccine? How are you going to manage your workforce? How are you going to get the work done? How are you going to prevent the loss of talent if you mandate the vaccine? And I also want to point out that at the current time, neither the EEOC nor OSHA has addressed the question of whether a COVID vaccine is advisable or lawful. So the current guidance from the EEOC, which was developed back in 2009, relative to the H1N1 virus and was more recently updated in March of this year, says that employers are encouraged to encourage their employees to get the vaccine. But that same guidance acknowledges that there is no vaccine yet. So we need to stay tuned. The bottom line.
Yeah, so lots to consider there from a compliance and planning standpoint. And Julianne, I put that what you just summarized together with the statistics we saw from the attendee survey at the start, with roughly half of the employers that are out there or listening in on this webinar just at those formative planning stages. If you were to articulate on the sort of the practical side, what's the planning that can be done now? What would be that first step, something to begin that process and be thinking about all those issues and be ready when they're at a point that the vaccine is more generally available?
Sure. I think first and foremost is to monitor the guidance and monitor the reports on the science. I would also add, if you're considering a mandate, consider who within the organization should be subject to the mandate. It may not, if you're, for instance, in a healthcare environment, it may be only those with patient contact as opposed to those who may work remotely in an office. You want to make sure that you have a place to handle requests for exemption or requests for accommodation under the ADA or the Title VII anti-religious discrimination provisions. That's going to be a time-consuming endeavor for those employers who already have mandates in place for the seasonal flu. You know what I'm talking about. All of those instances need to be handled on a case-by-case basis, and the EEOC has said that. It's all about an individualized analysis. So, think about how you're going to staff that. What are the resources that are going to be devoted to that process? Consider the consequences for a refusal to take the vaccine. Are you going to terminate someone's employment? And what are the alternatives? Masks, distancing, reassignment, different duties, work from home, all of those are possible accommodations to consider. Because if you mandate and termination is the result for a refusal, not only do you impact employee morale, like I said, but you risk losing talent and you risk legal claims for failure to accommodate under either the ADA or Title VII. I guess also you want to consider who will pay for the vaccine if it's mandated or encouraged. And I guess the one thing we've learned from an employment standpoint during this whole COVID time period has been communication, the importance of communication with employees on a macro level and also micro level, but just keeping in touch with people, making sure they understand, that the employer is understanding of their circumstance, and, reporting about, industry news, information about the vaccine, as the employer becomes aware, share that information with the workforce so that they become familiar with it and sensitized to it. And then I guess lastly, I would say for union environments, you want to make sure you review your collective bargaining agreements, because mandated vaccines are probably the subject of bargaining requirements under those collective agreements.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Julianne. Lots to think about, probably some policy issues there in the midst to begin to think about as well. So we are at the point where we have roughly 5 minutes of time left. And I know we're starting to see some questions coming in from some of our listeners and attendees. And so what I'd like to do at this point is go through some of these questions. We may not have time to get to all of them. And I may sort of lump some of them together as there are some very similar based questions. And I'll open it up to our panelists for their particular thoughts on some of these. So one thematic question that I will say I am seeing come up with a great deal of frequency on our Q&A is the degree to which the process over prioritization on distribution or other steps in this process that are currently out there, to what degree does the executive branch of our current administration have an ability to institute an override or to be subjected to outside influence points around the process for approvals of the vaccines and distribution? So I'll open that up to those on the panel that may have some thoughts about that.
Well, I can start. I mean, the amount of influence that the administration has is directly related to the regulatory processes that are already in place. So for something like an emergency use authorization, you could probably have a lot of political pressure put on the FDA specifically to make an accommodation, since the emergency use authorization process is already sort of an expedited, limited review process. Now, the administration probably has less ability to influence a biologics license application, since there's a thorough record that needs to be created and extensive guidance documents and regulations that apply to that process. But still, you will find that FDA has historically, in some limited situations, made decisions that were politically influenced. There was a medical device approval, for example, or medical device clearance, I should clarify, that occurred that was directly related to the pressure that was put on the agency by certain representatives and congressmen and senators from the state of New Jersey. So the FDA is not completely immune from those types of pressures. But for something that's less well-defined, that there isn't any regulatory structure or laws or guidance that underpins it, like, for example, the way in which vaccines will be distributed, those seem very ripe for serious political decisions in which states or which localities or which individuals get a share of the vaccine when it's in limited supply.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Seth. So we've got just a limited amount of time here, and I wanted to pose one sort of clinical question, Dr. Belongia, to you that came up, and it's probably prevalent in everybody's mind, and it really relates to whether or not we see the COVID-19 vaccine, going in the direction of the flu vaccine, such that it's essentially becomes an annual vaccine that everybody is asked to do by their healthcare providers.
The quick answer is we don't know. It's very likely that this virus it's not going to go away. It's going to stick around. It's going to become a seasonal virus, most likely. That's how pandemic viruses tend to work. But it's very different than the flu virus. The flu virus changes very rapidly from year to year. So far, this virus is not changing rapidly. And we do not yet know how long the immunity will last. So it is possible that people will have to get a vaccine every fall that's both flu and COVID. It's also possible that the protection from a COVID vaccine will last longer. I know we've heard of people becoming reinfected, and we've seen that antibody levels decline in people over time, and that's raised some concern that the protection might not be long lasting. But that's not guaranteed. We just don't know at this point until we follow people in the trials for a long time and see how long their protection lasts. Over.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time as they've listened in on our webinar today. Would like to thank Dr. Belongia, Seth Mailhot, Julianne Story. Wonderful. Thank you guys for sharing your wisdom and expertise with our audience today. I'd also like to take a moment and remind everybody that there is a number of future sessions that will be coming. We've listed the dates on the slide, and they'll be in very similar formats, and hopefully over what's close to your lunch hour to make them accessible and easy to be able to dial in. So thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. And on behalf of Husch Blackwell, we thank all of you for spending this time with us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in the Health Law and Innovation series. Thank you and have a great day.